In most realities, that boundary holds. The dead stay dead. The guilty fear judgment. The supernatural operates in shadows, whispering at the edges of human awareness. But there exist realities where those laws have already collapsed, where the boundary didn't just bend, it shattered completely, leaving behind a world that operates on entirely different rules. Rules written not in cosmic scripture, but in blood, desperation, and the grinding silence of a civilization that simply stopped. What happens when a force born from one universe's supernatural order crosses into a reality where that order never existed? What happens when the spirit of vengeance, a creature of punishment, of divine retribution, of hellfire forged in the machinery of sin and consequence, arrives in a world that already looks exactly like hell? That question has an answer. It begins on a Georgia highway in the summer heat, with the smell of rot hanging over everything like a second sky, and the dimensional tear opened without ceremony. No thunderclap, no pillar of light, just a sound like the universe clearing its throat, a deep, resonant wrongness. And then the hell cycle was there. Tires screaming against cracked asphalt, the engine's roar swallowing the humid air whole. Johnny Blaze felt the transition the way a deep-sea creature feels pressure change. A full-body wrongness, something fundamental shifting beneath the surface of reality. He gripped the handlebars, wrestled the bike out of its skid, and brought it to a stop in the middle of what had once been Interstate 85. He sat there for 3 seconds, taking it in. The highway was a graveyard of vehicles. Cars and trucks and minivans sat at every angle, some burned down to their frames, some still loaded with luggage that would never reach its destination. Suitcases had burst open across the asphalt, scattering clothes and photographs and children's toys across 2 lanes of civilizational collapse, on the tree line on both sides pressed close. Kudzu already beginning to reclaim the shoulders of the road. Georgia's summer heat pressed down from a white sky, thick and indifferent. And the smell. Even in human form, Johnny Blaze registered it immediately, a sweetness underneath the rot, a biological wrongness that no living world should produce in such volume. He'd smelled death before. He'd smelled battlefields, crime scenes, the aftermath of things Zarathos had done in his name. And this was different. This was ambient. This was the smell of a world that had stopped processing its dead. They came out of the tree line first, a dozen of them moving with that distinctive wrongness. The gait of bodies operating without the animating intelligence that should accompany motion. Skin gray-green and peeling, mouths working, eyes filmed over with a particular opacity of things that had crossed one threshold, but not the other. Not dead enough to stop moving, not alive enough to be reached. They tracked the sound of the Hell Cycle's engine with the mechanical persistence of creatures running on a single, consuming directive. Johnny watched them come. His jaw tightened. He'd faced demons. He'd faced actual hell, the real architecture of it. The bureaucratic nightmare of Mephisto's domain with its genuine supernatural weight. These things moving toward him across cracked asphalt were not demons. They weren't possessed. They weren't animated by any infernal intelligence he could feel in the supernatural register he developed over years of carrying Zarathos. They were something else entirely. Something that made the back of his neck prickle, not with supernatural recognition, but with something more primal. Wrong, his instincts said. These things are fundamentally, cosmically wrong. Zarathos stirred. The transformation didn't ask permission. It rarely did. The fire began at the base of his spine. He was climbing vertebra by vertebra with the familiar searing intimacy of something that had been happening to Johnny Blaze for longer than he cared to remember. His hands on the handlebars went from flesh to flame-wrapped bone. The Hell Cycle responded, its engine note dropping an octave. Hellfire beginning to lick along the exhaust pipes and wheel rims. The skull completed its emergence with a sound like a gunshot, and Ghost Rider sat up straight on the Hell Cycle, and 6 feet of burning skeleton draped in a leather jacket, chain already moving at his side with slow, predatory intelligence. The walkers didn't stop. Of course they didn't stop. Fear requires a functioning amygdala. Ghost Rider's head tilted, a gesture that, on a being without facial muscles, somehow communicated genuine curiosity. And then, the chain moved, and it caught the nearest walker across the torso, and the creature came apart the way things always came apart when Hellfire was involved. Decisively, completely, without the theatrical slowness of Hollywood fire. Just here, then gone. Then ash drifting in the summer heat. 3 more followed in the same motion, the chain operating with the fluid economy of a weapon that had been doing exactly this for decades. The rest of the dozen reached the Hell Cycle and accomplished nothing. Teeth that could end a human life by breaking skin scraped against flaming bone and found no purchase. Ghost Rider sat entirely still while 8 walkers threw themselves against him with everything their corrupted biology could offer. And the only sound was the chain moving. And then silence. And then ash. He looked at what remained. 12 small drifts of gray powder settling onto cracked asphalt. From the tree line, perhaps 30 more were emerging. Behind them, on the visible suggestion of many more still. Movement between the trees. The accumulated sound of dragging feet creating a kind of low, terrible white noise that stretched in both directions along the highway. The Hell Cycle's engine revved once, deliberately, like a predator drawing breath. Ghost Rider rolled forward. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The highway ahead stretched into Georgia's collapsed heart, lined on both sides with the evidence of everything this world had lost. Somewhere ahead, living people were surviving in the ruins of the civilization these empty vehicles represented. Somewhere ahead, human beings were doing what human beings do when all the rules dissolve. Some of them holding on to something worth saving, and some of them becoming something that the spirit of vengeance could recognize without any supernatural perception at all. Zarathos knew this world immediately, the way a fire knows dry wood. Johnny Blaze knew it too, in the quieter, a more painful way that a man who'd seen too much recognizes a place that confirms his worst suspicions about what people are capable of doing to each other. The Hell Cycle moved south, Hellfire trailing on the asphalt, the chain coiling and uncoiling at Ghost Rider's side, with patient, endless readiness. Around him, the world that had ended continued its slow business of demonstrating exactly what an ending looks like from the inside. It looked, Johnny thought beneath the flame, exactly like somewhere he'd already been. The highway gave way to a 2-lane county road, and the county road gave way to the scattered geography of rural Georgia in full collapse. Gas stations with their windows punched out. Fast food signs still standing because nothing had gotten around to knocking them down yet. A water tower with a name Johnny couldn't read from distance rising above a tree line that was slowly, methodically swallowing everything human beings had built. He rode at half speed, not from caution, but from something closer to assessment. Zarathos was processing this world the way a predator processes new territory. Cataloging, measuring, tasting the air for the particular frequencies that guided the spirit of vengeance toward its purpose. Those frequencies were everywhere. That was the problem. In the Marvel universe, the supernatural register Ghost Rider operated on had texture and specificity. Demonic presence felt a particular way, genuine evil. the kind that had made choices, that carried the accumulated weight of deliberate cruelty. Broadcast on a frequency Zarathos could lock onto across significant distance. The Penance Stare required that signal. It required a soul, a living architecture of choices and consequences. Something that could receive the full weight of its own actions reflected back through Ghost Rider's burning gaze. That was the mechanism. Sin required a sinner. A punishment required someone capable of being punished. He found the first real test 3 miles past a collapsed overpass. There were 11 of them gathered around what had been a family sedan, a mother, a father, 2 children, all 4 in various stages of the transformation that this world apparently visited upon its dead. They moved around the car with the aimless persistence of their kind, attracted to nothing in particular now, just existing in the terrible half-state that defined them. Ghost Rider stopped the Hell Cycle 20 yards out and sat with the engine idling, studying them with burning sockets that could perceive things beyond the visible spectrum. He saw nothing. That was the wrong way to say it. He saw bodies. He saw biological processes running on corrupted autopilot. He saw the physical evidence of whatever had happened to this world, written in gray skin and filmed eyes, and the particular slack absence of expression that came when everything that animated a face from the inside had vacated the premises. But in the register that mattered, the supernatural register, the one that showed him souls the way infrared shows heat, there was nothing there. Not darkness, not evil, not even the dim, guttering signal of a soul in torment. Just absence. Zarathos made a sound that Ghost Rider had never heard from him before. It was not rage. It was not hunger. It was something that, translated through the particular emotional vocabulary of a demonic spirit of vengeance, came closest to bewilderment. Ghost Rider dismounted. The chain coiled around his forearm with the automatic readiness of long habit. He walked toward the nearest walker, the father, or what had been the father, still wearing a button-down shirt with a company logo on the breast pocket. And the thing turned toward him with the mechanical interest his presence always generated in these creatures. No fear, no recognition, just the orientation of a very simple system toward a stimulus. He looked into its eyes, activated the Penance Stare. Not fully, not with the overwhelming intention he'd use on a genuine target, but enough to open the channel and to extend the supernatural perception that turned his gaze into a two-way mirror, reflecting a soul's history back at itself. The walker walked into it like walking into an empty room. Nothing came back. No cascade of remembered cruelty. No drowning weight of sins committed. No scream of a consciousness suddenly forced to experience everything it had inflicted on others, compressed into a single, annihilating moment. The Penance Stare reached into the walker and found the supernatural equivalent of a disconnected phone line. The channel opened and opened and opened and contacted absolutely nothing on the other end. The walker's hands found Ghost Rider's jacket and accomplished nothing. Its teeth scraped against the flame-wrapped leather of his forearm and left no mark. It pushed against him with the full strength of its reanimated biology and moved him not at all. Ghost Rider took it by the shoulders, gently by his standards, and simply held it at arm's length while he processed what he'd just learned. The soul was gone. Not damned, not captured by Mephisto or any other infernal entity he could detect in this world's supernatural background radiation, which was itself deeply strange. Not in any heaven or hell he could identify, not lingering as a ghost, not trapped in the body operating before him. The soul of the man who had worn this button-down shirt to work and driven this family sedan and died with his family in whatever catastrophe had swallowed this world. That soul was simply elsewhere, had passed through whatever transit system this universe used for its dead and arrived at whatever destination this universe provided. What remained was the body, animated by something biological and wrong, running on corrupted cellular machinery, serving no supernatural purpose whatsoever. I'm not a demon, not a revenant in any sense. Ghost Rider's extensive experience with the genuinely supernatural had prepared him for just biology, malfunctioning catastrophically, wrapped in the physical architecture of someone who no longer lived there. He released the walker. It came at him again immediately, and he stepped aside with the unhurried ease of someone sidestepping a slow-moving shopping cart. Zarathos processed this for a long moment. A Ghost Rider stood in the middle of the county road, while 11 walkers oriented on him and accomplished nothing. And the spirit of vengeance ran the implications of what the Penance Stare had just failed to do through whatever passed for his analytical process. This world was full of these things. Hundreds, thousands, perhaps more. The scale suggested by the abandoned highway, the empty towns, the complete absence of any living infrastructure implied a transformation that had touched an enormous percentage of the population. And none of them, not one, carried a soul that the Penance Stare could reach. Whatever had happened here had separated the dead from their spiritual architecture so completely that the primary weapon of the spirit of vengeance was useless against the primary threat of this world. The chain moved with sudden, savage efficiency. The 11 walkers became 11 drifts of ash in approximately 4 seconds. Ghost Rider stood in the settling gray powder and felt Zarathos arriving at a conclusion that Johnny Blaze had already reached from a different direction. The Penance Stare was built for the living. This world's monsters were already beyond it. But the living, the survivors, whoever they were, whatever they'd done to keep breathing in a place like this, they were a different question entirely. Their souls were present. Their choices had weight. Their sins had accumulated in the specific, measurable way that Zarathos could read like a language. Ghost Rider turned back to the Hell Cycle, mounted it, let the engine speak its low, resonant intention into the collapsed afternoon. The dead were beyond punishment. But this world, he was already certain, had no shortage of the living kind of monster. Zarathos knew the difference. He always had. The Hell Cycle moved forward, and following a road that curved toward the distant suggestion of smoke. Not the clean smoke of wildfire, but the particular smoke of human activity, of cooking fires and signal fires, and the fires people build when they're trying to tell the world they're still here. Ghost Rider followed it the way he'd always followed the signal of human presence in darkness. Not because he was looking for salvation. Because wherever people gathered in a broken world, of the full spectrum of what people were capable of gathered with them. And Zarathos had not come this far to find nothing to do. The smoke came from a high school. It was visible from 2 miles out, a thin, disciplined column rising from somewhere inside the campus perimeter. The kind of fire that someone was actively managing rather than the opportunistic blazes that marked most of the collapsed structures Johnny had passed. The school sat behind a chain-link fence that had been reinforced with whatever its inhabitants could find. Car hoods, wooden pallets, lengths of rebar threaded through the links at intervals. The parking lot outside the fence was a killing field of walker remains in various states of decomposition, evidence of repeated defensive actions carried out over what looked like weeks. Handmade weapons, shell casings, the particular archaeology of people who had learned to fight by fighting. Ghost Rider stopped the Hell Cycle on a low rise 200 yards from the fence line and let the engine idle while he assessed. There were people on the roof. He could see them even at distance. 2 figures moving along the parapet with the deliberate economy of people who had learned not to make unnecessary motion or noise. One of them stopped, raised something to their face, Binoculars, Johnny's human perception supplied. The other figure went still beside the first, and even across 200 yards of Georgia afternoon. He could feel the quality of attention they were suddenly paying to him shift from routine surveillance to something considerably more urgent. He could imagine what they were seeing. A figure on a motorcycle that appeared to be on fire, sitting on a rise above their position, radiating heat that warped the air around it in visible waves. The skull, the chain, the way the hell cycle's flames moved with organic intelligence rather than the mechanical behavior of normal combustion. He waited, or let them look. Inside the fence, there was movement now. Figures crossing the yard between buildings with purpose. The kind of coordinated response that spoke of a group that had established protocols. Survivors with systems. Survivors who had lasted long enough to develop something worth protecting. Ghost Rider watched with the patience of something that didn't experience urgency the way living things did, cataloging the details that told him what kind of people had made this place. Children. He could see at least 3 children moving between adults in the yard, being ushered toward a central building with the careful urgency of people prioritizing the right things. That registered in whatever emotional architecture existed beneath the fire and the supernatural purpose. The gate opened. 3 people came out. A man in his late 30s, moving with the careful confidence of someone who had earned authority through demonstrated capability rather than assumption. Dark hair, on the sheriff's patch still visible on his jacket, though the world the patch represented had ceased to exist. Eyes that were doing a very specific kind of threat assessment that Johnny recognized as the gaze of someone who had made hard decisions and was prepared to make more. Beside him, a heavy-set man with a crossbow, carried with the ease of long familiarity, moving a half-step to the right and slightly behind, in the unconscious positioning of someone who knew exactly what role they were playing. Where the third was younger, moving with a coiled readiness that reminded Johnny of people he'd encountered who had crossed a threshold. Not soldiers exactly, but people who had been through something that reorganized them from the inside. They stopped 20 yards out. The man with the sheriff's patch looked at Ghost Rider with eyes that were doing everything possible not to show the fear that his elevated heart rate and the slight tension in his jaw were broadcasting clearly. "And you're not a walker," the man said. His voice was level, controlled, the voice of someone who had learned to make statements rather than ask questions when they weren't sure they wanted the answers. Ghost Rider regarded him. The supernatural register was running constantly now, painting these 3 in the particular information that Zarathos processed automatically. The accumulated weight of choices made, actions taken, amongst the complex moral architecture of people who had been surviving at the edge of everything for an extended period. It was not a simple picture. None of them were. But the man in the sheriff's patch had something specific in his history. Violence, significant and recent, committed in defense of the people behind that fence. That sat alongside genuine grief in proportions that told a particular kind of story. Not a monster. A man doing monstrous things for reasons that weren't monstrous. Zarathos noted this without releasing any of his attention from it. "No," Ghost Rider said. His voice in this form had the quality of sound produced inside a burning building, functional but carrying additional information about combustion and heat. "I'm not." The man with the crossbow had it raised now, bolt aimed at the center of Ghost Rider's burning chest with the practiced steadiness of someone who wasn't doing it because he thought it would work, but because it was the thing you did when you didn't know what else to do, and lowering it felt like surrender. Ghost Rider appreciated the honesty of that. "What are you?" the man with the sheriff's patch asked. It was, Johnny reflected, a reasonable question. In most circumstances, he had a reasonable answer. Spirit of vengeance. Ghost Rider. The devil's bounty hunter. Various descriptions that meant something in a universe where devils and bounty and spiritual vengeance were concepts with established infrastructure. Here, standing in the parking lot of a collapsed Georgia high school, while the man who had clearly appointed himself responsible for everyone behind that fence waited for an answer that would help him decide whether to fight or run. The usual descriptions felt like they required context that this world didn't have, and something that punishes people who hurt the innocent, Johnny said, because that was the part that translated. The three survivors processed this. The crossbow didn't lower. There's no shortage of that here, the younger one said, and his voice carried a flatness that Ghost Rider recognized. The voice of someone who had stopped being surprised by how bad things got and was now simply keeping score. I know, Ghost Rider said. I can tell. The man with the sheriff's patch studied him for a long moment with those careful, exhausted eyes. Behind him, through the fence, the children were watching from windows. The whole compressed question of what this world had become was present in the 30 feet of cracked asphalt between them. On one side, a supernatural force of punishment and hellfire from a universe with entirely different rules. On the other, made three people representing everyone who'd survived long enough to have something left to lose. Rick Grimes, the man said finally. Not an offering of trust, an exchange of information, the minimum currency of cautious engagement. Johnny Blaze. Rick Grimes looked at the skull, the flame, the chain coiled at Johnny's side with its patient intelligence, and achieved the considerable feat of treating the name as if it were sufficient. You kill the dead. I kill everything, Ghost Rider said. But right now, I'm more interested in what's walking around alive. The crossbows stayed up. Rick's jaw worked slightly. The younger one had gone very still in the particular way of someone calculating angles. That could mean a lot of things, Rick said carefully. It means what I said it means. Ghost Rider's head turned slowly, surveying the perimeter, the reinforced fence, the evidence of sustained defense. You've built something worth protecting. It's who's threatening it? The three survivors exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. It was the look of people who had learned that offers of help came with costs, that strangers with capabilities were as likely to want something as to give something, that the correct response to apparent salvation was careful, documented suspicion. Then Rick Grimes turned back to Ghost Rider with the eyes of a man who had been wrong about people before and was building a methodology around not being wrong the same way twice. How about you come inside? He said, and we talk about that. They gave him the cafeteria. It was a practical decision. The largest interior space in the school, multiple exits, enough distance from the main population that whatever happened in there wouldn't immediately compromise the group's core. Rick Grimes was a man who thought in contingencies, and the cafeteria was the contingency space. Big enough to fight in, isolated enough to contain, far enough from the children that the children wouldn't have to see whatever came next. But Ghost Rider recognized the tactical logic immediately and didn't comment on it. He'd been placed in containment rooms before, usually by people with considerably more supernatural infrastructure than a reinforced chain-link fence and a man with a crossbow. He sat on a cafeteria table. The chairs were too small, and the gesture of sitting felt like the right currency for this particular negotiation. And let the transformation recede to its intermediate state. Not fully human. Johnny Blaze's face wouldn't emerge in an environment this saturated with the particular quality of threat and sin that this world produced at ambient levels. But the skull dimmed. The fire pulled back to something that could almost be described as contained. and the overall impression shifted from apocalyptic supernatural entity to something that could almost participate in a conversation. Rick sat across from him. Daryl Dixon, the crossbow. Johnny had learned, positioned himself at the cafeteria's main entrance with the bolt still loosely ready. A man who communicated his threat assessment entirely through body language, and had apparently decided that full vigilance was the appropriate setting and intended to maintain it indefinitely. A third person had joined them inside, a woman, Carol, who moved through the space with a quality of stillness that Ghost Rider's supernatural perception flagged immediately as interesting. She carried a tray of food she'd brought for Rick as cover, but her eyes were doing threat assessment math that was considerably more sophisticated than her presentation suggested. Zarathos noted her, filed her separately. "How long has it been?" Johnny asked. Rick understood the question immediately. How long since the world ended? How long since whatever had happened had happened? "Going on 2 years," he said, give or take. "And before me? Or anything else come through that didn't fit the pattern?" Rick and Carol exchanged that look again. What pattern? Walkers. Survivors. The things you know about. Ghost Rider's voice had modulated towards something conversation compatible. The burning building quality reduced to a low background register. "Anything outside that?" "No," Rick said, with the careful specificity of a man answering exactly the question asked and nothing adjacent to it. Johnny accepted this, and it confirmed what he'd already suspected from the supernatural register. This world had no active mystical infrastructure, no competing supernatural factions, no demonic presence operating alongside the biological catastrophe. Whatever had created the walkers was not supernatural in any sense Zarathos could identify. It was something else. Something that had achieved through biological mechanism what most apocalyptic scenarios required genuine metaphysical engineering to produce. He found that, and in some ways, more disturbing. "There's a group," Rick said, shifting forward slightly, "that's been pushing against our territory. They've taken people, killed people." He paused with the weight of someone selecting words that adequately represented something that resisted adequate representation. "They eat them." Ghost Rider was quiet for a moment. "The people they take." "Yes." Zarathos responded to this information the way he responded to all information about deliberate predatory cruelty directed at the innocent, with a slow, building intensification that Johnny had learned to recognize as the supernatural equivalent of a system coming fully online. He kept it internal, kept his expression, such as it was, neutral. "Where?" Ghost Rider said. "That's not..." Rick started. "Where?" Rick Grimes looked at him with those careful eyes. The calculation happening behind them was visible in the way a complex machine is visible through its outputs. The slight movement, the almost imperceptible processing. He was weighing what Ghost Rider represented against what he knew about the group to the north, and running the math on what a supernatural entity with apparently unlimited offensive capability and a specific interest in punishing predators might do to a fortified compound full of people who had made cannibalism their survival strategy. "We don't know exactly," Rick said finally. "We know the direction. We know what they call themselves." He paused. "Terminus. They put up signs. Come to Terminus. A sanctuary for all." His voice on the last 3 words carried a flatness that told the complete story of what Terminus actually was. Ghost Rider stood. The table creaked as his weight left it. The fire came back up automatically, responding to the clarity of purpose that had just crystallized in whatever served him as intent. Daryl's crossbow came fully up. "Not yet," Rick said quickly. To Ghost Rider, not Daryl. "We don't move on them without a plan. We have people who might be heading there. People we need to get out first." Johnny looked at him. The burning sockets regarded Rick Grimes with the full attention of something that was reading him on multiple levels simultaneously. The words, the body language, the supernatural weight of his choices and his motivations, and the specific texture of what he was carrying inside. What he found was not simple. Rick Grimes had killed, recently and significantly. He'd made decisions that had cost lives, not through malice, but through the cascading consequences of choices made under impossible pressure with incomplete information. He carried those decisions the way certain people carry weight. Not hidden, not processed, just present. A permanent feature of his internal landscape. The Penance Stare would find things in Rick Grimes. It wouldn't find a monster. There was a meaningful difference, and Zarathos, for all his supernatural single-mindedness, understood it. "Your people," Ghost Rider said, and described them. Something shifted in Rick's expression. The controlled assessment loosened fractionally, and underneath it was the specific terror of a parent, not metaphorical, actual parental terror, the kind that rewires the nervous system. "My son, Carl, and others." He paused. "A baby." Ghost Rider was silent. Around his hands, the Hellfire moved with the slow, meditative quality it sometimes took on when Zarathos was thinking rather than acting. The claimers found them 2 hours later, when they came through a gap in the fence perimeter that Daryl's patrol had missed. 8 men moving with the loose, predatory confidence of people who had decided that the collapse of civilization was a personal opportunity rather than a tragedy. Their leader was a man named Joe, white-bearded and unhurried, carrying his authority the way people carry something they took rather than earned. They had 3 of Rick's people at knife point before the alarm went up, and his Ghost Rider came through the cafeteria wall, not through the door. Through the wall, because the wall was there, and the time the door would have taken was time that a knife at a throat didn't have. Hellfire preceded him, blowing the cinder blocks outward in a cascade of burning debris, and he was in the yard before the dust settled, chain already moving. The burning skull turning toward Joe and his men with the full terrible attention of something that had been waiting for exactly this frequency of sin to present itself. Joe looked at Ghost Rider. To his credit, he didn't run. He was the kind of man whose psychology had reorganized itself around dominance so completely that even genuine supernatural threat registered primarily as a challenge to that dominance, rather than as information to act on. "Well," Joe said, now with the measured appreciation of a man who thought he was the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. "What in the hell are you supposed to be?" Ghost Rider looked at him, opened the channel. The Penance Stare hit Joe like a freight train hitting a paper wall. It worked. Of course it worked. Joe was alive. Joe had a soul. Joe had spent years making deliberate choices that had built an internal architecture of cruelty so dense and load-bearing that the Penance Stare didn't have to search for material. It was everywhere. Every person Joe had hurt for pleasure rather than necessity. Every moment of casual sadism exercised because the world had given him permission and he'd accepted enthusiastically. All of it came back simultaneously, experienced not as memory, but as sensation, and as full physical and emotional reality. Every victim's experience of Joe's choices transmitted directly into Joe's nervous system with perfect fidelity. Joe screamed. Then he stopped screaming because the experience was beyond the register that screaming could address. His men ran. The ones Ghost Rider's chain hadn't already addressed ran without looking back, leaving their weapons and their wounded dignity scattered across the school's parking lot. Rick Grimes stood in the yard and watched Joe collapse and did not intervene and did not look away. When it was done, Ghost Rider turned to him. "Terminus," Johnny said. "Now." Rick Grimes looked at what remained of Joe's capacity to threaten anyone ever again, and nodded once. The Hell Cycle didn't need roads. That was something this world hadn't accounted for in its geography of collapse. The way the most useful paths were no longer the maintained ones. The way the infrastructure of the old world had become obstacle rather than avenue. Ghost Rider moved through the Georgia landscape with the disregard for terrain that came naturally to something operating partially outside the physical constraints that governed normal vehicles. The Hell Cycle went where he pointed it. Through fields gone to seed, across creek beds, between trees that the fire didn't catch because Zarathos controlled his flame with more precision than his appearance suggested. Johnny Blaze rode alone. He'd left Rick's group at the school with the understanding. Not an agreement, not a negotiation, an understanding communicated in the specific currency of two people who recognized each other's capability. That he would go ahead, assess, ease, and not destroy everything before Rick's people had a chance to extract whoever might still be alive inside Terminus. The restraint cost him something. Zarathos pushed against it with the continuous pressure of a creature whose entire purpose was the elimination of exactly what Terminus represented. The supernatural register had been painting Terminus since Rick described it. A distant but growing signal of deliberate, sustained cruelty operating at industrial scale. The specific frequency of people who had made predation into philosophy and philosophy into ritual. Every mile closer intensified it. The signal sharpening from background noise to something with texture and detail and the particular weight of sins that had been committed so many times they'd become routine. Routine was what the Penance Stare found most efficiently. Habits of cruelty left the deepest channels. He stopped the Hell Cycle on a ridge above the Terminus compound as the light changed toward late afternoon. Below him, the facility spread across what had been a railroad terminus. Long, low buildings, chain link, the infrastructure of a place that had been designed for the management of large numbers of people and had found a new purpose that the designers had not intended. Signs were visible from the ridge. The sanctuary messaging that Rick had described, an optimistic lettering above gates that Ghost Rider's supernatural perception was already reading as something considerably different from their surface meaning. He let the transformation settle fully into its human mode. Johnny Blaze sat on the Hell Cycle in the fading afternoon, feeling the full weight of the world pressing in without the buffer of Zarathos between him and it. That was the thing nobody talked about when they discussed Ghost Rider. The other direction of the transformation. Becoming the spirit of vengeance was its own particular experience. But becoming Johnny Blaze again, in a place like this, in a world like this, was something else entirely. The supernatural perception switched off. The near indestructibility went with it. What remained was a man in his late 30s, lean and road-worn, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the Hell Cycle beneath him, and the absolute certainty that he was sitting above a place where human beings were being processed like livestock. He was hungry. Actually hungry. The specific physical complaint of a body that had been burning enormous amounts of energy and hadn't received any input in the 36 hours since he'd arrived in this world. His hands, bare and human and without flame, felt the evening air cooling against the sweat of the day. His boots were highway dusted. He had no food, no water, no shelter, no map of this world, no contacts beyond a group of survivors in a reinforced high school who had approximately 17 reasons to distrust him and were extending cautious cooperation because the alternatives were worse. In his own universe, these logistical concerns were manageable. There were ways to navigate, resources Ghost Rider's reputation opened, an entire supernatural infrastructure that provided context and occasionally cover. Here, human Johnny Blaze was genuinely, practically alone in a collapsed world where the primary threats were a biologically driven horde of the reanimated dead and whatever the living had decided to become. In response, he climbed off the hell cycle and moved to the ridge's edge on foot, dropping into the low crouch of someone who had learned to move without broadcasting presence. Below, the Terminus compound operated with the specific rhythms of a facility that had found its system and was running it. Figures moved between buildings with purposeful economy. Smoke from cooking fires rose from a central building. There were guards, actual, attentive guards, not the exhausted perimeter watchers of most survivor groups, but people stationed with deliberate fields of fire and the body language of individuals who expected threats and had protocols for handling them. He watched for 2 hours. The smell reached him as the wind shifted. And Johnny Blaze, in fully human form with nothing between him and the world's information, registered what it was with the specific sixth certainty of someone who had worked enough crime scenes to know that particular combination of fire and protein and something underneath that the human nervous system recoils from at a biological level before the conscious mind has finished identifying it. He'd been in bad places. He'd ridden into situations that had tested everything Johnny Blaze was, separate from what Zarathos was. And he'd come through them because the human part of Ghost Rider was not fragile. But sitting on the ridge above Terminus in the cooling Georgia evening, smelling what was coming from those cooking fires, he felt the full, unmediated weight of what human beings were doing to each other down there. And it sat in his chest like something with mass. Zarathos stirred, not urgently, with a kind of patient, building inevitability, the way water finds a crack and widens it over time. Not yet, Johnny told him. People to get out first. He moved back to the hell cycle and found, in the saddlebag that had no business containing anything because Ghost Rider didn't carry supplies, a bottle of water and a sleeve of crackers. He stared at these for a moment. The saddlebag occasionally produced things that were needed. It had always done this, on one of those low-level supernatural conveniences that Johnny had long since stopped questioning. Apparently, the phenomenon crossed dimensional boundaries. He drank the water slowly, watching the compound below, making the kind of patient tactical assessment that Rick Grimes would have called a plan, and that Johnny would have called knowing what you're walking into before you walk into it. The compound had 6 visible entry points, 4 guards on regular rotation, the 2 buildings that produced no movement, storage or something else, a central building where the cooking fires were, a cattle car configuration on the eastern rail line that Ghost Rider's human perception identified as recently occupied and recently vacated. He thought about Rick's people. Wherever they were either inside those walls already or approaching along the road, following the signs that promised sanctuary and delivered something for which there was no adequate sign. He thought about what happened to people inside those walls. The crackers were dry and tasted like cardboard, and he ate them methodically because his body needed the fuel, and because the alternative was continuing to think about what was in that central building. A twig snapped behind him. He turned. A walker had come through the tree line, alone, which was unusual. The solitary ones were often the most advanced in decomposition, moving on nothing but the most basic directional drive. This one had been a young woman once. The details were still visible beneath the transformation in the specific heartbreaking way they sometimes were. Johnny Blaze looked at her without the supernatural perception, without Zarathos framing his vision. Just a man looking at what this world did to people. He stood, picked up a length of rebar from the ground beside the hell cycle, and handled it quickly and quietly, in the way Rick's people had shown him this afternoon when they thought he wasn't paying attention to the tutorial they were giving each other. Then he sat back down and watched the compound and waited for Rick Grimes. The night came down over Georgia like a held breath. Rick's group arrived 2 hours after dark. They came through the tree line in single file with the practiced silence of people who had learned that sound was currency in this world and spent it carefully. Rick led, moving with the low, deliberate economy of someone navigating familiar darkness. Daryl behind him with the crossbow. Then Carol. Then 3 others, whose names Johnny hadn't learned, but whose capabilities he'd assessed from their movement. Competent, road-tested, he carrying the specific physical vocabulary of people who had survived long enough to develop genuine skill rather than just luck. Carol moved differently from the others. She'd changed clothes since the school, darker, more practical, her hair pushed back, something in her bearing that had shifted from the cafeteria's careful stillness into something more directed. Ghost Rider noted this the way he noted everything. He filed it in the register he maintained of people whose threat assessment required periodic revision. Rick crouched beside Johnny at the ridge's edge and looked down at the compound below. In the darkness, it was quieter, but not still. The guards maintained their rotation. The cooking fires had reduced to coals that produced a faint orange suggestion of light through the central building's windows. "How many?" Rick asked. "Visible personnel. 12. Could be more inside." Johnny kept his voice low, matching the register of the conversation Rick was having with the darkness. 6 entry points. The eastern rail line had a cattle car configuration, recently used. Rick absorbed this without expression. Our people could be in there. Or they already passed through. Daryl said from his left, the flatness in his voice doing the work of elaborating what passed through meant in Terminus's operational context. Nobody responded to that for a moment. The particular silence of people sitting with an unbearable possibility without letting it become a certainty that would compromise their function. "We go in quiet," Rick said. "Extract whoever's alive, then..." He stopped, looked at Ghost Rider with the careful eyes that were perpetually running calculations. "Then, whatever you need to do." Johnny looked at him. "You're giving me permission." "I'm telling you the sequence," Rick said, with the quiet precision of a man who had thought about the ethics of what he was about to authorize and arrived somewhere he could live with. "People first, then justice." Zarathos responded to the word justice with a resonance that ran through Ghost Rider's entire form. A tuning fork struck at exactly the right frequency. Johnny kept it contained. Carol was already moving toward the perimeter. She went alone, which told Johnny everything he needed to know about the revision he'd been applying to his assessment of her. She moved through the darkness below the ridge with a quality of invisibility that was entirely earned, not supernatural, not even particularly exotic. Just the specific skill set of someone who had spent significant time being unseen as a survival strategy and had developed it past the point where it was strategy into something closer to instinct. She reached the fence line and was through it in 40 seconds, using a technique that suggested considerable prior practice with exactly this type of obstacle. Ghost Rider watched from the ridge, with the supernatural perception running at low power, painting the compound in the additional information that Zarathos provided. The signal he'd been tracking all day intensified as he focused it downward. The accumulated weight of what Terminus had done, was doing, intended to continue doing, radiating upward like heat from the coals of their cooking fires. Every person inside those walls carried it to varying degrees, some more than others, some with the specific density that came from being architects rather than instruments. He identified those specific signatures and noted their locations. Inside the compound, Carol had disabled a guard with an efficiency that confirmed his revised assessment. Rick and Daryl were moving down the ridge now, using the distraction her entry had created. Johnny waited until they were committed to the approach before he moved. because what he was about to do was not quiet. And the sequence Rick had specified required them to be inside before he changed the operational parameters of the entire facility. He found the main gate. 2 guards. They saw him coming and raised their weapons with the trained response of people whose protocol covered a wide range of threats. Ghost Rider walked toward them at normal pace, chain beginning its slow rotation at his side. And in the orange light of the compound's perimeter, the burning skull and the Hellfire and the full visual information of what was approaching them registered in both guards' nervous systems simultaneously. One ran. The other, a younger man whose fear had hardened into something that looked like resolve, but was actually a survival mechanism. He held his weapon up and said, "Stop," with a steadiness that Johnny noted and respected even as he continued walking. "You don't want to be here," Ghost Rider said. "Leave." The young man held for 3 more seconds, genuinely held, which indicated a moral architecture that the supernatural perception confirmed was more complicated than his current employment suggested. Then he lowered the weapon and stepped aside. Ars and Johnny filed his face away in the category of people whose sins were present, but not of the weight that Zarathos was here to address. The gate came off its hinges. Not explosively, Ghost Rider simply took it and set it aside with the unhurried efficiency of someone performing a maintenance task. The chain wrapping the lock mechanism and the hinges and relieving them of their structural function in one smooth motion. Inside Terminus, someone started shouting. The response was immediate and organized. These were people with protocols, which meant they'd anticipated breach scenarios, which meant they'd survived previous confrontations by having systems in place. Figures converged from 3 directions with weapons raised, moving with coordination that would have been genuinely formidable against any threat that could be addressed with conventional weapons. Ghost Rider walked into the compound and let Zarathos fully forward for the first time since the highway. The Hellfire came up completely. The chain became something that moved through the compound's interior geography with the fluid, 3-dimensional intelligence of a thing that understood space differently than human weapons did. Around corners, through gaps, between structures, covering angles that conventional weapons couldn't address. It didn't kill indiscriminately, for this was important and sometimes misunderstood about the spirit of vengeance. Zarathos was not chaos, not destruction for its own sake. He was purpose. He was the specific, targeted application of consequence to those who had earned it. The supernatural perception painted each figure in the compound with their moral weight as they came within range. The ones who had participated in Terminus's core practice with enthusiasm. The ones who had made it philosophy, made it pleasure, made it identity. Those were the ones the chain found with precision. The ones who had arrived here as victims and stayed from terror or necessity. The ones whose sin was survival in extremis rather than predation as preference. Those the chain moved past without touching, and Ghost Rider's voice, carrying the resonant authority of something that could not be doubted, told them clearly, "Go. Now, move." They went. Rick's group had found the holding areas. Johnny could hear the sounds of people being moved with the careful urgency of extraction. Voices, footsteps, the specific quality of sound that people make when they've been in enclosed spaces for extended periods and are experiencing something they've stopped expecting to experience. He moved toward the central building. The cooking fires, the source of the smell that had reached him on the ridge, and that was considerably more direct now, inside the compound, with nothing between him and it. The architects were inside. He could feel them. The specific signatures he'd identified from the ridge. The people whose choices had built Terminus into what it was and maintained it and expanded it, and would have continued expanding it indefinitely if the sequence of tonight's events hadn't been set in motion by a dimensional tear on a Georgia highway. Ghost Rider put his hand on the central building's door. Zarathos had been patient all day. The dead had been beyond him. Ark, the living threat, had required sequencing and restraint, and the accommodation of Rick's priorities. Inside this building was something that required none of those accommodations. He opened the door. The architects of Terminus had approximately 3 seconds to understand what had come for them. Then the Penance Stare opened across all of them simultaneously. Not the focused, single-target beam of standard application, but something Ghost Rider deployed rarely. The wide-aperture version, the one that cost him significantly, and that Zarathos reserved for situations that warranted the expenditure. Every person in that room received the full weight of what they had chosen to become. Reflected back through Ghost Rider's burning gaze with the unsparing fidelity of a system that did not grade on a curve or make allowances for circumstance. The screaming lasted longer than Joe's had. When it was done, Ghost Rider stood in the silence of the central building, while the cooking fires burned down and the compound outside was quiet with a specific quality of aftermath. Rick Grimes appeared in the doorway. He looked at what remained of Terminus's architects and at Ghost Rider standing among them. Hellfire steady and purposeful. And he said nothing for a long moment. "Everyone's out," Rick said finally. "Our people are alive." Ghost Rider turned toward him. The burning sockets regarded Rick with the full supernatural attention that had been running constantly since they met, the perception that painted people in their moral weight and history, and the complex texture of who they actually were beneath what survival had required them to become. "All of them?" Johnny asked. And the question carried a weight that went beyond the head count. Rick understood what he was asking. "All of them," he said. And his voice carried something that Ghost Rider recognized as the specific, exhausted relief of a man who had been carrying the worst possible expectation and had just been relieved of it. Johnny let the Hellfire recede slightly. Around them, Terminus burned with the steady, cleansing quality of fire that had found appropriate purpose. Word traveled the way word always traveled in a collapsed world, person to person, campfire to campfire, passed along the survivor networks that had replaced every communication infrastructure the old world had built. It moved faster than Ghost Rider expected, given the conditions. Within a week of Terminus, 3 separate groups had found Rick's school compound with the same story delivered in variations that shared a consistent core. Something was moving through Georgia. Something that burned. Something that found the people who preyed on survivors and administered a justice that the collapsed world had no other mechanism to deliver. Some of the stories were accurate. Some had accumulated the distortions that fear and hope apply to information in transit. One version had Ghost Rider as 30 feet tall. Another had him preceded by a river of fire that consumed everything wicked and left the innocent unharmed, which was more metaphorically true than literally true, but captured something real about the operational parameters. A third version, delivered by a teenage girl who'd been separated from a group near Macon, described him simply as the thing that came for the people who deserved it. And that version, Johnny thought, was probably the most useful. The useful part was also the complicated part. Rick's compound had grown. The Terminus survivors who'd been extracted added numbers. Yes, and numbers added complexity. And complexity added the specific interpersonal friction of people with incompatible survival philosophies attempting to coexist inside a reinforced perimeter. Ghost Rider observed this from the compound's edges, where he'd established a functional presence that was neither fully integrated nor separate. Close enough to provide the deterrent value his proximity offered, distant enough that the children weren't having nightmares about the burning skull in their immediate sightlines. He'd been in this world 11 days. The practical reality of those 11 days had developed its own rhythm. The transformation cycled with the pattern it always did. Ghost Rider from dusk through the activity hours, Johnny Blaze through the quieter periods when Zarathos stood down from immediate operational readiness. In his own universe, this cycling had a supernatural logic governed by threat proximity and demonic moon phase mechanics that he'd never fully understood. Here, it seemed to operate on simpler principles. The world provided constant threat. Zarathos maintained constant readiness, and Johnny Blaze emerged in the gaps when the immediate pressure reduced enough to allow it. He'd been helping, and that was the part he hadn't anticipated and hadn't entirely planned for. The way his presence had shifted from tactical asset to something more integrated. Daryl had stopped pointing the crossbow at him, which represented a significant evolution in their relationship. Carol had begun including him in supply run planning with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had assessed a resource and decided to use it. Rick consulted him about threat intelligence with the careful, unbounded collaboration of a man who valued what Ghost Rider could do while maintaining precise limits on how much operational control he extended. Johnny found he didn't mind the limits. Rick's instinct for where the lines were was generally sound. The mega herd arrived on day 12. They smelled it before they saw it. The accumulated biological information of a mass walker event. The ambient rot amplified beyond anything the compound's inhabitants had encountered in their defensive experience. Ghost Rider's supernatural perception registered it differently. Not smell, but the vast, spreading absence of the signal he associated with living souls. A negative space in the supernatural register that expanded as the herd's leading edge came into range. A silence so large, it had its own kind of weight. Daryl's scouts reported it from the western approach, and the herd was moving along a river valley that bent toward the school compound with the terrible indifference of natural processes. Not directed, not intelligent, not aware of the compound or its inhabitants in any meaningful sense. Simply following the accumulated environmental cues of a mass of reanimated biology moving along the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance currently led directly toward everything Rick's group had built. Conservative estimate, 400 walkers. The scouts' faces when they delivered this number told Johnny that 400 was beyond the scale of anything the compound's defenses had been designed to address. Rick called everyone together in the yard. Johnny stood at the edge of the gathering and watched the way Rick communicated with his people. Direct, unvarnished, sharing the actual information rather than a managed version of it. Treating the group as capable of handling truth and making decisions from it. It was a leadership style Ghost Rider recognized from people who understood that the cost of managed information was the erosion of the judgment it was supposedly protecting. "We can't hold the fence against those numbers," Rick said. "The fence wasn't built for this." "We run," someone said from the middle of the group. The voice of pure survival calculation, no judgment in it. "We have people who can't run fast enough," Carol said. Flat, final, the children, and the injured from the Terminus extraction. 2 people who'd arrived at the compound in the past week in conditions that precluded sustained rapid movement. Rick looked at Ghost Rider. Johnny had been expecting this. He'd been running his own assessment since the scouts' report. Mapping the herd's approach vector against the compound's geography and the surrounding terrain and the specific capabilities that Zarathos brought to a situation that conventional human defensive resources couldn't address. He'd been doing the math the way he always did the math. Not the tactical arithmetic of military planning, but the specific Ghost Rider calculation of what he could do, what it would cost, and whether it aligned with the purpose that animated him. 400 walkers. No souls to punish, no sin to address, no Penance Stare application, no moral dimension whatsoever. Just biology. malfunctioning at catastrophic scale, about to destroy something worth protecting. Zarathos didn't do this for free. The spirit of vengeance was not an instrument of general protection. There were cosmic entities for that. Powered heroes, defenders with that specific mandate written into their operational purpose. Ghost Rider's mandate was justice, specifically the retributive variety, specifically directed at those who had earned it. But Johnny Blaze had a different mandate. And in this world, where the supernatural infrastructure that distinguished the two was absent, the line between them had been blurring in ways that he'd been noticing and not fully resolving. He walked to the fence line, stood at the western perimeter and looked toward the river valley, where the leading edge of the herd was becoming visible. Gray shapes between the trees, the accumulated movement of 400 reanimated bodies generating its own kind of atmospheric pressure. Behind him, Rick's people were moving with the organized urgency of the extraction protocols, the children being moved to the compound's most protected interior space, the injured being positioned for mobility, weapons being distributed and checked. The compound was preparing for the worst version of what was coming. Ghost Rider opened the gate and walked out. The Hell Cycle was there, waiting with the supernatural punctuality it always demonstrated. He mounted it without ceremony, felt the engine's response come up through the frame with the specific resonance that meant Zarathos was fully engaged and ready to operate at maximum capacity. He looked back once. Rick Grimes stood at the fence with the crossbowless Daryl beside him, and Carol and the rest, watching with the expressions of people who had stopped being surprised by impossible things, but hadn't stopped registering them. "Stay inside the fence," Ghost Rider said. He rode toward the herd. What followed was not a battle in any sense that required tactical complexity or strategic execution. It was something more elemental, the application of Hellfire at sustained maximum output to a problem defined entirely by scale. The Hell Cycle moved through the herd's leading edge, and the chain moved with it, and the fire came off Ghost Rider in waves that the walkers moved into with the same indifferent persistence they brought to everything. Because the thing about creatures that felt no fear was that they also felt no self-preservation. And the thing about Hellfire was that it found biological matter entirely adequate as fuel. Ghost Rider drove into the center of 400 walkers and let Zarathos do what Zarathos did. The fire spread through the herd with the specific efficiency of a system designed for exactly this scale of application. Not the targeted precision of the Penance Stare. Not the surgical chain work he'd used on individual threats. This was the full output, the maximum capacity, the version of Ghost Rider that even Mephisto engaged with, carefully because it was the version where Johnny Blaze had stepped back entirely, and Zarathos operated without the human component's moderating influence. The herd burned. It took 40 minutes. Ghost Rider moved through it continuously, the Hell Cycle tracing patterns through the geography of the dying herd. The chain and the fire, working in the sustained concert of something that had been doing this for longer than most of the people in the compound had been alive. By the end, the leading edge had become ash, and the trailing edge had turned in the instinctive response to fire that even reanimated biology retained. And the turning trailing edge became ash too, because Ghost Rider went after it. When he came back through the gate, trailing smoke and the settling residue of 400 walkers rendered down to their component ash, the compound was silent. Every person in the yard was watching him, the children most of all. Ghost Rider looked at them, at their faces, at the specific quality of the attention children pay to things that are outside the categories they've been given. The direct, unmediated perception that hadn't yet developed the adult capacity for looking away from what was genuinely there. One of them, a boy of about 8, looked at the burning skull with eyes that had clearly already seen enough of the collapsed world to recalibrate what qualified as frightening, and said, "Did you get all of them?" "Yes," Ghost Rider said. The boy nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. Rick Grimes stood in the yard and looked at Ghost Rider for a long moment with those careful, exhausted eyes that were doing the continuous calculation of a man trying to understand what he had, what it cost, and what it meant. "Thank you," he said. Johnny let the transformation recede. The skull dimmed. Johnny Blaze sat on the Hell Cycle in the aftermath smoke and felt the weight of 40 minutes of maximum output settling into his bones. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Something bigger is coming." The something bigger had a name. It came from a survivor named Abraham. A large, red-mustached man who arrived at the compound on day 15 with 2 companions and the specific bearing of someone carrying a mission that had reorganized his entire psychology around its completion. He'd heard about Ghost Rider from a group they'd passed near Griffin, the Burning Skull story in its 30-foot-tall variation, and had come to the compound with the pragmatic directness of a man who decided that if a supernatural engine of destruction was operating in his operational theater, he wanted to know about it before it became a variable he hadn't accounted for. Abraham Ford sat across from Ghost Rider in the cafeteria. The same table, the same containment room logic that Rick had applied at the beginning, the compound's inhabitants apparently having decided this was the appropriate venue for conversations involving potentially dangerous new arrivals, and laid out what he knew about the saviors with the clipped economy of a former military man briefing a superior. Negan. The name landed in the cafeteria with the specific weight of a name that had been spoken in fear so many times it had accumulated mass. Abraham delivered the operational details without editorializing. The network of outposts, honor the tribute system, the savior's scale and organization, and the specific enforcement methodology that kept the surrounding survivor communities compliant. The methodology involved a barbed wire wrapped baseball bat and the deliberate, theatrical public application of it to people selected for maximum psychological impact on the witnessing community. Ghost Rider listened. Zarathos listened differently. The supernatural perception was running its continuous assessment, painting Abraham in the moral weight of his history. And what it found was a man whose sins were significant and whose capacity for violence was considerable, but whose core operating principle had somewhere underneath the mission and the military bearing a genuine protective impulse that pointed outward rather than inward. A complicated man, not a monster. "How many?" Ghost Rider asked. "Saviors." Abraham's eyes didn't flicker. "Hundreds. Multiple outposts. A coordinated command structure." He paused. "They're not like Terminus. They don't eat people. They've built something that functions." Another pause, shorter, carrying different weight. "It functions on other people's terror." Rick had been listening from the cafeteria's entrance. He came fully into the room now and sat down, and the 3 of them, Ghost Rider, Rick Grimes, and Abraham Ford, occupied the space with the particular density of a conversation that everyone in it understood had operational consequences. "You've encountered them," Rick said to Abraham. "Not yet. But we're heading somewhere that has." Abraham's jaws set. Eugene has information about a potential solution to all of this. The whole Walker situation. We need to get him to Washington. Rick absorbed this. Ghost Rider watched Rick absorb it. Watched the calculation run through those careful eyes. The way he weighed Abraham's mission against the compound's needs. The way he held multiple operational considerations simultaneously without losing track of any of them. Johnny was thinking about Negan. He'd been thinking about Negan since Abraham said the name. because the supernatural perception had responded to the name the way it responded to signals. Not the name itself, which was just sound, but the accumulated weight that Abraham's description had built around it, the specific frequency of what the Savior's operation represented. A man who had built an empire on the systematic application of terror, who had made cruelty into infrastructure, who had taken the collapse of civilization's constraints and treated it as permission granted, and then as philosophy developed, and then as identity perfected. The Penance Stare had a preferred target profile. Negan was it in almost every particular. "Where are the Saviors operating?" Ghost Rider asked. Abraham looked at him, then at Rick. A three-way assessment of what the question meant and what the answer would set in motion. "Why?" Abraham said. "Because I'm going to find their leader," Johnny said. "And I want to know which direction to start." The silence in the cafeteria had a specific quality. Rick and Abraham were doing the calculation that Ghost Rider had already done, running the implications forward. What happened to the Savior's organizational structure if the person who had built and maintained it was removed from the equation by the specific method Ghost Rider was describing? What the power vacuum looked like. Whether the network collapsed or fragmented or reorganized under different leadership with potentially different methodology. "It's not that simple," Rick said. "It is for me," Ghost Rider said. "What you do with the aftermath is your problem, and the Savior's leader has built something on the deliberate destruction of innocent people. That's my problem. If you go in without knowing the full picture," Rick said carefully, "people die. His people, maybe. Ours, definitely." He leaned forward. "The Saviors have a dead man protocol. Leadership gets taken out, the outposts activate independently. Communities under tribute get hit simultaneously." He paused. "I've been planning for this. I need more time." Ghost Rider looked at him. The supernatural perception ran its assessment of what Rick was saying. Not for deception, because Rick Grimes didn't have the kind of moral architecture that produced casual deception, but for the specific weight of what was underneath the words. What he found was genuine strategic concern wrapped around something more personal. The specific terror of a man who had survived this long by controlling variables and was sitting across from a variable that couldn't be controlled, only directed, and was attempting to direct it carefully. "How much time?" Johnny said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Rick met his gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who had looked at things considerably more terrifying than burning eye sockets and maintained his composure. "We need to locate the outposts. We need to make contact with the communities under tribute. We need to coordinate so that when the head comes off and the body doesn't thrash and destroy everything in reach." Johnny was quiet for a long moment. 2 weeks, he said. "Then I find him." Rick nodded once. The deal, not an agreement, not a partnership, an acknowledged understanding between two people operating on parallel tracks that happened to be running in the same direction, was made. What followed was the 2 weeks, and the 2 weeks were their own kind of education. Ghost Rider ranged the territory around the compound, running the scouting function that Daryl would have performed, but could perform faster and with considerably less risk, given the parameters of his survivability. He found 2 Savior outposts, identified their personnel, assessed their operational patterns. The supernatural perception painted each outpost's inhabitants in their moral complexity. Some Saviors were what Abraham's description suggested, true believers in the gospel of Negan's methodology, their sins dense and deliberate. On others were something more complicated. People who had come to the Saviors from necessity or fear or the specific practical logic of a collapsed world where power was the only currency, and the Saviors had the most of it. Ghost Rider did not touch the outposts. He watched them, cataloged them, reported to Rick with the precise operational detail that Rick incorporated into a plan that grew in complexity and coordination as the 2 weeks progressed. Communities were contacted. Agreements were reached. The specific logistics of a coordinated multi-group action against an entrenched, well-resourced opponent were assembled with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that timing was the difference between success and catastrophe. On day 19, something happened that Ghost Rider hadn't anticipated. He found Negan's convoy, not at an outpost. On a road, in motion, 6 vehicles moving through the Georgia countryside with the confidence of people who expected the road to clear for them. He'd been ranging 15 miles from the compound when the convoy's leading vehicle came around a bend, and the supernatural perception hit him with the signal he'd been calibrating toward for 2 weeks. Negan was in the 3rd vehicle. Ghost Rider sat on the hell cycle on a ridge above the road and felt Zarathos respond to that signal with the full and immediate intensity of recognition. The specific frequency of a man whose sins had the particular quality of someone who hadn't just done terrible things, but had built an identity around doing them with style. Who had made his cruelty into performance because performance made it more effective as terror and more satisfying as expression. The Penance Stare could reach him from here. Johnny held Zarathos back, felt the pressure of it, the specific, sustained effort of keeping the spirit of vengeance on restraint when the target was directly in range, and the purpose that animated every aspect of Ghost Rider's existence was screaming at him that here was the work, here was the reason, here was exactly what he'd been built for. He thought about Rick's dead man protocol, the simultaneous activation of outposts, the communities that would pay the price. He watched the convoy pass below him and did nothing, and the effort of doing nothing cost him more than the mega herd had. When the last vehicle disappeared around the bend, Ghost Rider sat on the ridge in the Georgia afternoon and felt the specific exhausted weight of a being of vengeance who had chosen restraint, and understood for the first time what Rick Grimes felt every day. The difference between capable and right was a distance that some people never learned to measure. Johnny Blaze was learning it in a world that had no shortage of object lessons. The plan came apart on day 23, not through failure of execution. Rick's planning was sound, the coordination was in place, the communities had confirmed their roles, and the outpost timing had been mapped with the precision of someone who understood that simultaneous action was the only action that prevented the Dead Man Protocol from activating. It came apart because the world that had ended didn't stop producing new variables, and then the specific new variable that arrived on day 23 was a savior patrol that found the compound's location through a chain of circumstance that nobody could have predicted, and that Rick's planning, for all its thoroughness, hadn't accounted for. 7 saviors. A lieutenant named Simon, thin-faced and efficient, carrying the specific authority of someone who had been given significant operational latitude by the man above him, and had interpreted that latitude expansively. He arrived at the compound's gate with 6 armed men, and the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this particular visit many times and expected the same outcome he always got. Ghost Rider was not at the compound when they arrived. He was 6 miles northeast, running surveillance on the 2nd outpost, when Carol's voice came across the radio Rick had given him, a concession to operational coordination that Johnny had accepted and actually used. Another thing he hadn't anticipated about this world's effect on his methods. "We have visitors," Carol said. Her voice was the specific controlled flat of someone managing a situation that required the management of their own reaction as much as the situation itself. The kind that count things. Johnny understood immediately. He turned the hell cycle south. He arrived at the compound's outer perimeter in 4 minutes, which was faster than the Hell Cycle should have been able to cover 6 miles of Georgia countryside. But the Hell Cycle operated on its own relationship with physical constraint and didn't require Johnny's input on the question. He came in from the eastern approach, killed the engine 200 yards out, and covered the remaining distance on foot with the speed that Zarathos provided in partial transformation. Not the full skull, not the complete Hellfire, but the enhanced physical capability that sat between Johnny Blaze and Ghost Rider in the continuum of what he was. He came over the fence at the compound's northeast corner and moved through the interior with the fluid economy of someone who had spent 23 days learning this space, its sightlines, its acoustics, the specific geography of its defensive architecture. Simon was in the yard. He'd positioned his 6 men with the practiced efficiency of someone who ran these tribute assessments regularly. 2 at the gate, 2 covering the main building's entrance, 2 moving through the compound's interior spaces in the inventory-taking posture of people cataloging assets. Simon himself stood in the center of the yard with Rick in front of him. And the conversation they were having had the specific cadence of a negotiation, where one party had already decided the outcome and was performing the negotiation as theater for the benefit of the other party's dignity. Ghost Rider moved through the compound's interior shadows toward the yard's edge and assessed. The children were inside the main building. He could hear them. The specific quality of enforced silence that children produce when adults have communicated with absolute clarity that silence is required. Carol was somewhere he couldn't immediately locate, which his revised assessment of Carol told him was the most tactically relevant piece of information in the current situation. Daryl was visible at the main building's entrance, crossbow down, body language communicating compliance, while his eyes communicated something considerably different. Simon was talking about what the compound owed. The numbers were specific and deliberately calibrated. High enough to be genuinely burdensome, low enough to be technically survivable. The exact mathematics of a system designed to keep its tributaries functional but permanently dependent. He delivered these numbers with the cheerful precision of someone who found the work satisfying. Ghost Rider listened for 30 seconds. Zarathos had been running the assessment since Simon came into range, painting him with the supernatural perception that cataloged the specific texture of what this man was. Simon was not Negan. He didn't have Negan's particular genius for making cruelty into philosophy. What he had was something in some ways more straightforward and in some ways worse. Genuine enthusiasm for the work. He didn't perform his cruelty for psychological effect, and he enjoyed it independently of its utility. The Penance Stare was going to have significant material to work with. But there was the Dead Man Protocol. There was Rick's plan, 4 days from execution. There was the coordinated timing that depended on Negan's outposts being hit simultaneously, which depended on Negan remaining operational as the organizing principle of his network for 4 more days. Simon was not Negan. Simon's removal did not trigger the protocol. The Ghost Rider stepped into the yard. The effect was immediate and total. Simon's 6 men registered the burning skull with the specific physiological response that genuine supernatural threat produced in human nervous systems regardless of psychological preparation. The involuntary, precognitive alarm that operated below the level of trained response and expressed itself as a half-second of complete physical stillness before any trained behavior could activate. Ghost Rider used the half-second. The chain moved through the yard in a single, geometrically precise arc that covered all 6 Savior's weapon hands simultaneously, not lethally, not yet. Just the specific application of Hellfire-wrapped chain against firearms that relieve the weapons of their functional integrity, and their holders of the ability to use them. 6 guns became 6 twisted, partially melted objects in 6 stunned hands in approximately 1.5 seconds. Simon turned. To his credit, and Ghost Rider's supernatural perception noted this credit with the specific attention it paid to people who demonstrated unexpected qualities. Simon didn't run. He looked at the burning skull and the chain and the Hellfire and performed the rapid assessment of his tactical options with the professional efficiency of someone who had encountered a great many situations and developed the habit of evaluating each one cleanly. His assessment took 2 seconds. His conclusions were accurate. He kept his hands visible. "Well," Simon said, with a quality in his voice that was performing composure over a foundation of something less composed. "You're new." "Simon," Ghost Rider said. The name from Rick's intelligence briefings, delivered with the specific weight that came from knowing it. Simon's composure shifted fractionally. Being named by an unknown entity had that effect. "I'm going to look at you," Ghost Rider said. "When I'm done, you're going to leave this compound and every compound like it, and you're going to deliver a message to your employer." Rick was watching from 6 feet away, with the careful stillness of a man who had just had his plan modified by an external variable and was running the implications. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were doing the calculation. Ghost Rider could see him arriving at the same conclusion Johnny had reached, that Simon's removal from the network was a variable the Dead Man protocol didn't account for. "What message?" Simon said. "You'll know when I'm done looking at you." The Penance Stare opened. Simon was a harder case than Joe had been. Not because his sins were less, but because his psychological architecture had developed significant load-bearing walls around them. The specific defensive construction of someone who had been living with the full weight of their choices for long enough to build elaborate justification structures. The Penance Stare didn't care about justification structures. It went through them the way the chain went through chain-link fence. Not around, not over, through, with the specific authority of something that understood the difference between what people told themselves and what they had actually done. What came back through the channel was considerable. Simon lasted longer than Joe had. He was a functionally tougher psychological architecture, which meant the Penance Stare had to work harder, which meant what Simon experienced lasted longer, with proportionally less mercy. He was on his knees before it was done, which Ghost Rider noted as a significant physical response from a man of his particular psychological construction. When it ended, Simon stayed on his knees for a moment, and then he stood, with the careful deliberateness of someone reassembling themselves from constituent parts. His face was different, not broken. The Penance Stare didn't break people, it showed them, and what people did with having been shown was their own business. But the cheerful efficiency was gone, replaced by something raw and less managed. "The message," Ghost Rider said. Simon looked at him. His voice, when it came, had lost its performance quality entirely. And what remained was just the voice of a man who had just experienced the complete, unmediated catalog of what he was. "What do you want me to tell him?" "Tell him the spirit of vengeance is in his world," Ghost Rider said. "Tell him it's not here for the dead." He paused, letting Zarathos put the full weight of supernatural authority into what came next. "Tell him I'm coming. And tell him to think very carefully about whether the life he's built is worth what it costs to keep." Simon looked at him for 3 seconds, with eyes that had just seen things that reorganized what eyes were for. Then he turned to his men, who had been standing in the paralysis of people processing events that exceeded their categorical framework, and said, "We're leaving," with the flat finality of a man who had made an irreversible decision. They left, and Rick watched the gate close behind them. He stood in the yard for a long moment with the expression of a man running calculations on what had just happened and what it meant for the timing of everything he'd built.
4 days, he said. 4 days.
Ghost Rider confirmed. Carol emerged from the shadows of the compound's eastern building, where she had been positioned with a look on her face that told Johnny she had been prepared to do something considerably more direct if the situation had developed differently. She assessed the aftermath with the quick efficiency of someone moving on to the next problem. "He'll tell Negan," she said. "That's the point," Johnny said. Rick looked at him. "Umbrick, you want Negan to know you're coming." "I want Negan to spend 4 days knowing I'm coming," Ghost Rider said. "I want him to think about it. I want him to feel what it is to have something coming for him that he can't negotiate with, can't intimidate, can't absorb into his system." He paused. "I want him to understand what his people have felt." Rick was quiet for a moment. Then something moved through those careful eyes. Not approval exactly, but the specific recognition of a man who understood psychological warfare and was acknowledging a variant of it he hadn't considered. 4 days, Rick said again. This time, it carried the weight of a countdown. Across Georgia, in whatever compound Negan occupied with his barbed wire-wrapped bat and his empire of terror, a thin-faced lieutenant was driving toward him with a message that the spirit of vengeance had spent 23 days calibrating to land with maximum effect. The Ghost Rider walked back to the Hell Cycle and sat with the engine off, feeling the specific quiet of a plan in its final phase. Zarathos was entirely still. The patience of something that had learned, in this world, to wait. 4 days. Negan knew he was coming. That was evident from the moment Ghost Rider crested the ridge above the Savior's main compound on the morning of day 27. Not from any supernatural perception, though the supernatural perception was running at full capacity and painting the compound below in the densest concentration of moral weight he'd encountered since arriving in this world. But from the simple, observable fact of what Negan had done with 4 days of knowing. He'd assembled everyone. The compound was full. Not just the regular personnel that Outpost Intelligence had suggested. Negan had pulled his people in from surrounding positions, consolidated his strength, packed the interior of the compound with saviors in numbers that the compound's architecture was visibly straining to accommodate. Ghost Rider counted from the ridge with the patient thoroughness of someone for whom counting wasn't the point. But information was. Icebrew and arrived at a number that told him Negan had interpreted the message exactly as intended and had responded with the specific psychology of a man whose entire identity was built on never appearing to retreat. Negan had gathered his people around him because Negan didn't run. Johnny had expected this. It was, in its way, a form of respect for the message. Acknowledgement that the thing coming warranted preparation, even if the preparation was ultimately inadequate. Rarik's coordinated strike had executed at dawn. 3 communities, 2 outpost teams, simultaneous action timed to the minute, with the precision that Rick's planning had been building toward for 3 weeks. Ghost Rider had received Carol's radio confirmation 40 minutes ago. Outposts neutralized. Deadman protocol never activated. The Savior's network severed at its peripheral nodes before Negan could send the signal. The Empire's arms had been removed. What remained was the head. He rode down the ridge. The Hell Cycle moved through the compound's outer perimeter without engaging the gate. Through it, the chain handling the structural components with the same unhurried efficiency it brought to every obstacle. Hellfire tracing the entry point with the clean precision of something that understood the difference between destruction with purpose and destruction without it. The outer fence became an opening. Ghost Rider rode through it, and the Saviors were waiting in the compound's central yard. There were a great many of them. They had guns, many guns raised and aimed with the coordinated discipline of people who had trained for this specific scenario, who had been told by their leader that this was what you did when something came for you and you were the Saviors. You stood your ground and you demonstrated that nothing in this world could take what you'd built. The guns fired. Ghost Rider rode into the volley, and the rounds accomplished what rounds always accomplished against the spirit of vengeance at full capacity. They produced sound and light, and the physical evidence of impact against something that wasn't meaningfully impacted. The Hellfire absorbed the kinetic energy with a specific disregard of a system that processed incoming force, the way an ocean processes thrown stones. As Ghost Rider rode through the gunfire with a hell cycle trailing flame across the compound's packed dirt, and the chain moving in the three-dimensional arc that it used when the geometry of a space required it to cover multiple angles simultaneously. The saviors broke. Not all at once. These were people with genuine resolve. People who had been organized and motivated by a man whose understanding of human psychology was considerable. And that organization held for longer than most groups would have maintained it under these circumstances. But the specific thing that Negan's psychology couldn't fully prepare people for was the Penance Stare. Because the Penance Stare didn't operate on physical courage. It operated on moral weight. No amount of resolve changed what a person had done. Your Ghost Rider moved through the compound, and the Penance Stare opened and closed with the specific efficiency of something that had been calibrated over 27 days in this world. Not wide aperture, not the mass application he'd used at Terminus, but precise, targeted. The single focus version directed at the specific signatures the supernatural perception had been identifying as the compound's architects of cruelty. The ones who had made choices. The ones who had built what Negan built and maintained it with genuine investment rather than fearful compliance. They fell the way Joe had fallen, the way Simon had fallen to his knees on a compound floor 600 miles behind him. Not dead, not physically broken, but shown, completely and without mercy, what they actually were. The others, the ones whose moral weight was the specific gravity of people who had come to the saviors from fear or desperation or the practical calculus of a collapsed world that offered limited options. Those Ghost Rider moved past. His voice told them what it had told the Terminus victims, what it had told the young guard at the gate who'd lowered his weapon and stepped aside. Go. Now. Move. Most of them went. Negan was in the center of the compound. He was standing in a cleared space that his people had instinctively created around him. The specific personal geography of a man whose authority was expressed partly through the physical distance others kept from him out of habit. He had the bat, Lucille, the name that survivor communities said, with the specific weight of the worst thing they knew, resting on his shoulder with the practiced ease of long familiarity. He was watching Ghost Rider cross the compound toward him with eyes that were doing something Johnny hadn't seen from any opponent in this world. Negan was genuinely, carefully thinking. He was tall, lean, somewhere in his 40s, carrying himself with the specific physical confidence of a man who had built his entire operational methodology on projecting exactly this quality of presence. The leather jacket, the measured stance, the absolute refusal to show the specific thing that Ghost Rider's supernatural perception could read clearly was present underneath the performance. Not fear exactly, but the specific sensation of a man who had spent 4 days genuinely contemplating what was coming and had arrived at conclusions about it that his public presentation wasn't going to acknowledge. So, Negan said. His voice was exactly what Rick's intelligence had described. Rich, controlled, carrying the practiced authority of someone who had learned that voice was a weapon and had sharpened it accordingly. You're the thing. Ghost Rider stopped 10 feet from him. I've been thinking about you, Negan said. 4 days. Which is, let me tell you, 4 days more than I think about most things. He shifted Lucille on his shoulder with the casual ease of a man handling a familiar tool. Word is, you burned up 1,000 dead ones without breaking a sweat. Word is you walked into Terminus and did things to people that made hardened survivors lose their dinner. He paused. Word is you've been running around Georgia playing Avenging Angel for weeks. Spirit of vengeance, Ghost Rider said. There's a difference. Is there? Not a question, a consideration. The supernatural perception was running its full assessment of Negan, and what it found was the most complex moral architecture Ghost Rider had encountered since arriving in this world. More complex than Rick's, more complex than Carol's, more layered than anything Simon or Joe or the Terminus architects had produced. Negan had layers. The sins were there. Dense, deliberate, chosen with the specific intentionality that Zarathos required as a threshold. But underneath them was something that the Penance Stare always found in people who had built elaborate structures over their actual nature. The original thing they'd built the structure to protect. There was grief in there, old and load-bearing. You've hurt a lot of people, Ghost Rider said. I've kept a lot of people alive, Negan said, with the immediate, impracticed quality of a response that had been integrated so deeply into his operational identity that it came out before conscious thought. Those aren't the same thing. In this world, they are. Negan's eyes didn't move from the burning sockets. You've been out there. You've seen it. What it is. What people do to each other when there's nothing stopping them. Something shifted underneath the performance. Barely visible, but present. The specific tells of a man who believes what he's saying at the exact same time he knows it's incomplete. I stopped them. My way, yeah. But stopped. Ghost Rider looked at him. Let Zarathos run the full assessment. Hold it. Examine it with the complete attention of something that had been making exactly this evaluation for longer than this world had existed. Look at me, Ghost Rider said. Negan looked at him with the eyes of a man who had been warned, Tinas who had had 4 days to think about this moment, who had spent those 4 days in the specific psychological preparation of someone who had decided that whatever was coming, he would face it standing up because that was the only way Negan faced anything. The Penance Stare opened. What happened to Negan was different from what had happened to the others. Not because the Penance Stare modulated its output based on complexity, it didn't, and it was merciless in its consistency. But because what Negan experienced when every choice he'd made came back to him simultaneously was filtered through that complex architecture, through the grief and the genuine protective impulse and the years of decisions that had built the empire and the specific cost of maintaining it. And what emerged on the other side of the full experience was not the collapse that Joe had produced or the reorganization that Simon had demonstrated. What emerged was a man sitting in the dirt of his own compound, bat set aside, hands on his knees, looking at the ground with the expression of someone who had just been shown the complete distance between what they told themselves they were and what they had actually become. He stayed there for a long time. Ghost Rider stood over him and let the fire burn at its steady, purposeful level and waited with the patience of something that understood this part. The after, the silence, on the specific weight of a moment where punishment had been administered and its recipient was processing what it meant. Rick Grimes is coming, Ghost Rider said finally. With enough people to hold what you've built, they'll run it differently. He paused. You'll answer to him. Negan looked up. His eyes were different, not broken, not empty, just shown. And if I don't, he said. It wasn't defiance. It was a genuine question, asked by a man calibrating what his options actually were. And then I come back, Ghost Rider said simply. And we do this again. Except the second time I won't stop with the Penance Stare. Negan looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the compound around him, his people, the ones who were still standing, the ones who had lowered their weapons and were watching this exchange. With the expressions of people witnessing something that was reorganizing their understanding of what the world contained. This world, Negan said quietly, and to himself as much as anyone, it really does find new ways. He didn't say yes. He didn't say, "I'll comply," or "I surrender," or any of the words that would have made the moment clean. But he set Lucille down in the dirt beside him and left her there. And that specific gesture carried the weight of a decision in the language of a man who communicated primarily through what he did with his hands. Rick's convoy arrived 40 minutes later. The world that had ended was not finished ending. That was the truth Ghost Rider carried out of Georgia. If carrying was the right word for what a being of vengeance did with the things this world had shown him. The walkers still moved through the landscape in their tens of thousands, beyond punishment, beyond reach. The vast biological machinery of a catastrophe that had no supernatural author and required no supernatural solution. Just the grinding, daily, human work of survival and rebuilding, and the specific courage of people who kept choosing tomorrow in a world that had stopped guaranteeing it. He stayed 3 more weeks. Not because Zarathos required it, not because the spirit of vengeance had unfinished business in the technical sense. The architects of deliberate cruelty had been addressed, the Penance Stare had found what it came for, and the purpose that animated Ghost Rider had been served with a specific completeness that Zarathos recognized as sufficient. He stayed because Johnny Blaze wasn't finished. Rick's coalition held. Negan's network, redistributed, fed more people than it had terrorized. The communities that had lived under tribute found the transition complicated and imperfect, and sometimes violent in the specific ways that power transitions always were. Because the world had ended, but human nature hadn't, and the work of building something worth protecting was never finished, and never clean. Johnny watched this and thought about his own world, its supernatural infrastructure, the machinery of sin and consequence that he'd been serving for longer than he could clearly remember, and understood something this broken world had taught him that his own hadn't. The dead were beyond punishment. The living were the only jurisdiction that mattered. The dimensional tear opened on a Tuesday morning, and the way it had closed, without ceremony, just the universe clearing its throat again. Ghost Rider sat on the hell cycle at the compound's gate, while Rick stood on the other side of the fence with those careful, exhausted eyes that had seen everything and were still, against all evidence, looking forward. "You could stay," Rick said. "No," Johnny said. "But you don't need me to." Rick nodded once. The specific nod of a man who knew it was true and found it equally relieving and sobering. Or Ghost Rider rode into the tear. Behind him, Georgia continued its slow, stubborn resurrection.